Welcome to Connect. Today we're connecting with esteemed journalist Austin Jenkins. Welcome, Austin.
Thanks for having me.
Also joining us today are students from Lake Washington High School and Open Window School. Welcome to the program. Okay, so to kick things off, Austin, please give us a little introduction and tell us what you do.
Sure. So I am one of, I think it's now 6 full-time State House reporters covering the Capitol from the Capitol campus. And I work for the Public Radio Northwest News Network, which is a consortium of public radio or NPR stations in the Northwest in Washington and Oregon. And so I serve stations in Seattle, in Portland, Pullman, Spokane, Eugene, even down into Ashland, Oregon. And my job is to cover state government, the legislature, the governor, state agencies, state politics, and elections. And I've been in this position, in this job, since 2004. So it's been a really long time, but I'm still enjoying it. And then I also host the show Inside Olympia on TVW. It's the state's longest running, I believe, public affairs program. It's a weekly interview show with policymakers, elected officials, state agency heads, and that airs on Thursday evenings.
Thanks, Austin. If you haven't checked out Inside Olympia, do check it out. It's a great show. Let's dive right into the questions.
Hi, my name is Ava Banks, and I'm a senior at Lake Washington High School in Kirkland. My question is, how do you deal with the various party interpretations and biases?
It's a good question, Ava. The nature of covering the legislature is it is a partisan environment. Politics are very much at play. And what I like to say is that my job is to cover the Democrats and the Republicans, to do so in a way that is fair, that my job is not to take sides, it's to be tough, but fair with them. And I think if you asked people in Olympia, I've covered Olympia for a long time, I think if you asked around about my reputation, I hope what you would hear is that Austin is tough, but fair. That said, a lot of what goes on in Olympia is remarkably bipartisan in nature. There's a lot the two sides agree upon. And in fact, there are friendships across the aisle. So what I often say is it's the 80-20 rule, that 80% of what they're working on, they generally agree upon and they get along on those issues. And if you look at the votes, they are unanimous or near unanimous. And it's really the 20%, and this is rough, but the 20% of topics and issues and bills that they really fight about. And on those issues, the differences are very stark. So again, I look at this as, yes, it's a partisan environment, but that's not the only storyline. And I also think it's important to cover public policy and to look at the issues and then to think about what the political or partisan overlay is rather than the other way around. So I often lead with policy in my stories and explain what the politics are around those policies instead of leading with the politics, because I do think at the end of the day, it's the policy that's going to affect the day-to-day lives of the 7.5 million Washingtonians.
So true. Thank you. Our next question is from Charlotte of Open Window School.
Hi, my name is Charlotte, and I'm in 8th grade at Open Window School. So after reading your article on the limits being put on the Washington House Democrats due to COVID-19, I was able to learn about the Washington legislature preparing to have a session virtually. My question regards both how this hybrid program will work and the effects you think this unprecedented session will have on the future of legislative sessions in Washington state.
That's a great question, and especially thinking about the future and what permanent changes might come around. So it's hard to know how this is going to work because it hasn't been tried before, at least not here. What we do know is that it sounds like the House with 98 members is going to be almost entirely remote or virtual. They'll have the presiding officer in the chamber and maybe a few key staff members, maybe a few other lawmakers, but by and large, they're requiring their members to operate remotely. The Senate, it sounds like, with it's a smaller body, is more likely to, 49 members, is more likely to have a hybrid scenario where some of the senators are in the chamber and some are at home, and they're trying to give each other some social distance. It remains to be seen how this is going to work. I mean, they're going to have to do Zoom sessions for the for the committee work, the public hearings, and then also for the floor sessions. My experience is that a Zoom meeting works well up to about 12 people. Once there's 98 people on the call, I'm not quite sure. I'm not even sure, how many, either how small the faces will be or how many times you'll have to scroll to see everybody. I mean, those kinds of things will be interesting. I think they can work out the logistics of recognizing people who want to speak and enforcing time limits. If they have to, and somebody's, needs to be gavelled down, the speaker can gavel them down. So that part I think is going to be manageable. Another big question is, how will the public engage? Because normally what happens is the public comes down and testifies in the hearing rooms. That option isn't going to be available. Now it will be remote testimony. There are some who are worried that this will make it less transparent. On the other hand, there may be opportunity here, and this gets to your question about long-term change. Getting to Olympia for a lot of people in the state is a real challenge, especially in the winter if you're coming from east of the mountains and you have to cross the passes. So the opportunity for somebody to testify from the comfort of their living room may in fact be easier for that person, depending on where they're coming from. And in the long term, it may be that the legislature is going to be more open post-COVID to allowing people to do remote testimony, whereas before it was sort of experimented with. Some committees allowed it, some didn't. I think going forward, we may see a lot more opportunities to do that because this crisis will have proven that it's possible and it is a way to expand access.
Our next question comes from Maggie of Open Window School.
I'm Maggie Madison from Open Window School. In humanities class this year, we have learned that the structure of government along with the roles and how bills can be made. I know that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed how people do their jobs, and after reading that the Washington State Democrats have recommended that they limit the amount of bills proposed, how do you think that putting that limitation will affect the quality of the bill? Also, do you think that there will be a controversy of what is urgently needed to be a law?
Yeah, great questions, Maggie. So the House Democrats have asked their members, and they have 57 of them, to limit the number of bills they introduce to 7. Now, it's not a mandate. They can't enforce this. It's a request. I've been told that the average number of bills introduced by House members in a normal year is 12, but it's really all over the map. Some lawmakers might introduce a few bills and some will introduce 20 or more. The idea here, though, is to ease up on the staff members who actually have to write the bills, draft them, do the amendments, and to make it easier for them because they're working under less than ideal circumstances. In a normal year, you might see 2,000 to 2,500 bills introduced. Maybe 500 of those would get passed. This would be in a long session, so about 20%. I'm hearing from Senate Democrats that they think, and they have not imposed this same sort of limit or suggested limit, but I'm hearing from them that they think the volume of bills that move through this coming year might be half of what's normal, just because the process is going to be more cumbersome and slower. I'm not totally convinced because I also know that there's a lot of, on the part of lawmakers, it's really hard to get them to scale back on their ideas and their enthusiasm for introducing bills and for moving them through. But clearly this is going to be a different set of norms in terms of how they're operating, and no doubt it's going to slow things down. In terms of I don't know that it'll affect quality. I think it will reduce the topics that they're able to tackle. House Democrats are already saying to their members, let's focus on 4 key areas. COVID relief, for sure. The budget, which has to be written. This is the 2-year budget writing year. Climate change, racial equality. And I should mention, as part of the budget, really they frame that more as economic recovery. So they're talking about 4 big issues that they want to deal with, the House Democrats. I'm sort of waiting to see how this plays out, but I know it's not going to be normal, but I also know that it's really hard to rein in, especially lawmakers who've just been elected and are really eager to hit the ground running.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Alex about education.
Hello, my name is Alex from Open Window School. So we learned in humanities class this semester that as an aspect of federalism, the state governments have to provide most of the funding for public education in their states. As such, in the recent plan for the Washington State House to only introduce 7 bills, the only things mentioned for the bills to focus on are racial equity, COVID-19 response, economic recovery, and global climate change. And while these are all certainly important issues, whose education makes up about 50% of the state budget and is not mentioned, do you think that education should be focused on more in the state legislature, especially in this chaotic time when many schools hope to transition back to in-person schooling?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that education is a big part of the budget. It's now more than 50% of the state budget. By the way, the state budget over 2 years, they budget on a biennial basis, is over $50 billion now. So, and those are state dollars. The state constitution, to quote it again, Article 9, Section 1 says, "It is the paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for the education of all children residing within its borders without distinction or preference on account of race, color, caste, or sex." So the number one job of the legislature, according to, and the state generally, according to the state constitution, is to amply fund and provide for education. And there was a big lawsuit over this called the McCleary lawsuit that went on for years and actually resulted in the percentage of funding that from the state budget that goes to public education going from under 50% to now over 50%. So in one sense, the heavy lift, the big work around education has been completed, but funding education and reforming education is never done. That's an ongoing issue, and it's always a top issue in every legislative session. Here's what I think about this, is that you're right, it was not mentioned as one of the 4 top priorities of House Democrats. When I asked the Speaker of the House, Lori Jenkins, about this, her response was, yes, but education is part of the COVID response. And figuring out ways to, for instance, maybe get students back into classrooms, at least on a hybrid basis, is undoubtedly going to be part of the conversation. In fact, the new Senate Republican leader, John Braun, already has a bill and a proposal to create a new set of metrics around that. So that's no doubt going to be discussed. I'm not saying it'll pass, but that will be part of the conversation.
We have another great question from Lake Washington High School. Here's Caitlin.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Urick, and I'm a senior at Lake Washington High School. And my question is, how do you plan to fund the small businesses that have been dramatically impacted due to COVID-19? Thank you.
Yeah, good question and very timely question, Caitlin. As I mentioned earlier, there are some limits on what the state can do. We're hearing from Republicans that they would like to see a package of tax relief measures implemented. So a reduction or a delay in the payment of business and occupation taxes, a delay in when business license renewals are done. So the idea being and I'm hearing this in particular from House Republicans, what could the state do to reduce the tax bills or to delay the tax bills for businesses that may be suffering during this time? Democrats are pretty reluctant to do anything that's going to reduce tax collections, in large part because the state is already facing quite a reduction in, and certainly not what they thought it might be previously, but still a drop in revenue, and balancing the budget is going to be more difficult this year than in previous years. So they're going to be a little bit reluctant to give up, I think, additional tax dollars, and I'm not sure that they're convinced that that's the best way to help businesses. So you're going to see some partisan fights around this. What are the best policies for small business relief look like? In the meantime, the CARES dollars that came from the federal government have to be spent by the end of the year, and many of the last dollars available are being made available in the form of grants and to some extent loans to small business. And in fact, the governor's expanded after he closed indoor dining at restaurants and bowling alleys and gyms and theaters recently. He expanded this grant program, and now they're kind of in a mad dash, a mad race as the year finishes out to get those dollars out to the businesses that have applied for them in the form of grants, I think in the range of $10,000 to $20,000. Once that money's spent, though, it's one-time money, and after the end of the year, it's not available anymore. So the legislature is certainly going to have to come back in January and start to think about what else to do for small business. And I will just repeat again that there's a lot of hope, especially in the part of Democrats, that there's a second relief package from Congress. But they really can't rely on that or depend on that, because we know that there's absolutely no guarantee that Congress will act.
Another question from Lake Washington High School. Here's Sydney.
Hi, my name is Sydney. I'm a senior at Lake Washington High School in Kirkland, and my question is, will there be an increase in taxes due to the devastation on the economy from COVID?
Very astute question, Sydney. I can't say for sure, but I know that there are a lot of Democrats who are very interested in looking at what they would call new revenue options. Others would say taxes. That could and is likely to include the capital gains tax, which I mentioned previously, which has also been considered previously in the legislature, but has not passed. I don't have a good sense right now if the capital gains tax has a better chance in 2021 or not. Beyond that, there aren't a lot of options for the legislature. You know, we have a sales tax and a property tax and this business and occupation tax, and then there's real estate excise tax and some others, but the three key main legs of the stool are the property tax, sales tax, and business occupation tax. And it's not very politically palatable to do much with those. I mean, if you raise the sales tax, people are going to complain. Property taxes are already burdensome. The business and occupation tax, if you raise that, even on certain businesses, especially during times like this, you're going to get pushback on that. So the way I think about this is that there's often a lot of talk early in session and a lot of ideas get introduced. By the end of the 105 days, when they're going to write the budget and balance the budget, what you'll often hear from the Democratic budget writers is, if they can balance the budget and fund the government that they believe fits their priorities and do so without taxes, they probably will. If they're short some, then they very likely will default to looking for new revenue or a way to raise additional revenue within existing tax structures. And we really won't have a clear sense of where they're going to land on this until much later in the legislative session. So you'll see a flurry of ideas on the front end of the session, but you really won't know which of those they'll adopt, if any of them, until almost the very end.
We're down to 3 more questions. Let's take the next one.
Hello, my name is Indira Parra. I'm a senior at Lake Washington High School in Kirkland, and for the next upcoming legislative session, I was wondering if you anticipate more or less influence from interest groups in the policies that you guys create.
Nita, that's a great question, and it's something I'm wondering about too, because not only is this going to change how the legislature functions, it's going to change how lobbyists do their work. Lobbyists in normal times show up at the Capitol and they wear down the marble and they wear down their the soles of their shoes, working the halls of the Capitol, meeting face to face with lawmakers in their offices, grabbing them when they can in the hallways, sending notes into them when they're on the floor of the House and Senate, and asking those members to come out and speak to them on issues. It is face to face work. And so this is going to be really interesting to see how this is going to work. I imagine what most of the legislators will do is, instead of having 15-minute increments of office hours where lobbyists and constituents and others can come in and meet with them for 15 minutes in person, they'll set this up virtually, and they'll have a full day of Zoom meetings when they're not in committee or not on the floor. I can imagine that there will also be a lot of text messages being sent. And as a reporter, that raises some questions. Not that that doesn't happen already, but I'm starting to think a little bit about transparency issues and how, at least when we're in the Capitol, we can see who's talking to whom, and we're not eavesdropping. I don't know what's being said, but you sort of get a sense of, oh, this issue must be getting contentious because there's a group of lobbyists that represent this interest or that who are meeting with the key lawmakers on that issue, right? You kind of get a sense, you have situational awareness. As a reporter, I'm thinking about the blind spots I'm going to be having if this is all being done virtually. So yeah, everybody's going to have to change up their game. I don't think that special interests, lobbyists, interest groups are going to have any less influence or role this year, but I certainly think that they're going to have to find new and innovative ways to be connecting with those lawmakers. And frankly, as a reporter, I'm going to be having to find new ways to cover the legislature because this is completely new and unprecedented for me as well. So anybody who's outside trying to look in on what's happening, and in the case of the lobbyists, influence the process, in the case of reporters, cover the process, we're going to have to learn as we go and figure out some new tricks.
Certainly, learning as we go is something we definitely have to master during this time. Our next question is from Nellie of Lake Washington.
Hi, so my name is Nellie and I'm from Lake Washington. I'm a senior. My question is that with the looming COVID vaccines, is it possible that the legislature will have a discussion surrounding the handling, the distribution, and the management of these?
Yeah, Nellie, that's a really timely and astute question as well. It was a couple of years ago that the legislature removed the personal philosophical exemption for the measles vaccine, which is required to go to school. So there are still exemptions, there's still a religious exemption, but the personal or philosophical exemption went away. That was very controversial, and it came in the wake of measles outbreaks in Southwest Washington and I believe elsewhere. So in the context of the COVID vaccine, one of the questions will be, what will the rules of the road be? Will students have to be vaccinated to come back to school? And if so, will the measles rule apply, being that there will be exemptions, but not the personal philosophical exemption? And my thinking is this, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a lawmaker, is that if they wanted to apply that rule to this vaccine, they would have to pass some legislation around that. I've asked the governor's office on this, and to date, their answer back has been, we don't have an answer for you. We're not there yet in terms of thinking about that. There, on the Republican side, I've already seen at least one pre-filed bill. I can't give you the details on it other than to say the general idea is to create some quote unquote protection for people from having to get a vaccine. And I would describe this as sort of the approach being, we don't want the government to tell us whether we have to have this or not have this, and to make clear that exemptions are protected. So I think you may see that tension that we saw a couple of years ago around the measles vaccine kind of crop up again. But I'm not convinced that they're going to have to do legislation, because they may also just want to see how available is this COVID vaccine, how readily is the public accepting it and taking it. And at this point, I think the bigger concern is, will there be enough soon enough for all the people who want it? And until you get into a situation where people are saying, I won't take it, and it is creating a problem for the schools, for instance, the legislature may not feel like its hand has been forced to even address this. Again, this is conjecture. I really don't know. Clearly going to be watching it, but I could see this going any number of ways.
And finally, our last question comes from Howie. Go ahead, Howie.
Yeah, hello. My name's Howie. I'm a senior at Lake Washington High School, and my question is not about the upcoming legislative session, but rather you. And it is, what inspired you to begin reporting on state policies and state government, and in a way that connects the public directly to state government and issues that concern them?
I so appreciate this question, and especially that word connects, because that fundamentally is what this is about, is figuring out how to connect what happens in the Capitol and state government in Olympia to Washingtonians who are living their daily lives, dealing with all of the pressures that go on with doing so, and oftentimes not having the capacity or the bandwidth to really deeply engage with what's happening here. And the other reality is that people oftentimes are paying close attention to what's happening in their own backyard, at their kid's school or at City Hall, and then also paying attention to what's happening in the other Washington. And oftentimes it's what's not happening because of gridlock in Congress, but national news gets so much coverage. And as I said at the top of this program, there's only 6 of us on a full-time basis covering the legislature anymore. So it's very hard with just 6 people, to have a lot of coverage. So I am constantly thinking about, who's my audience? What do they need to know? What are the issues that are most likely to affect people's day-to-day lives? What are with the question came up earlier about interest groups and special interests and lobbyists. What are the issues? I often like to identify issues where there's a lot of special interest that might be specific to advancing the cause of that interest, but maybe it's not going to be beneficial to the broader public, and highlighting those situations, because I do think that the danger can be, if the public is not paying a lot of attention, then that amplifies the role and power of special interests and lobbyists. So I'm always interested in looking at the role of the third house, which is the lobbyist core. And then fundamentally, why do I do this? Because I am really passionate about trying to figure this out. I actually like working in a place where there isn't saturation coverage and where there are too few reporters, because I feel like I have a mission every day. I feel like it really matters if I show up to work each day. And if I don't tell the story, it may not get told. As opposed to if I was in Washington, D.C., there might be 12 reporters telling some version of that same story, right? So I also think about the fact that we're a growing state, fast growing state, 100,000 people coming in a year, 1 million a decade, it seems like these days. We're already 7.5 million people. And so I'm always thinking also just about, what is the story of our state? Where are we in our history? I love having this front row and getting to see how the issues are changing, how the legislature is changing. It's a much more diverse legislature than it was when I arrived back in 2004. Absolutely, the issues have changed. And I've gotten to see how our state is evolving and how our state is changing from my front row seat at the state capitol. And that keeps me coming back each day.
Well, it was definitely a pleasure connecting with everybody. Thanks again, Austin. Do you have any last messages that you want to share with our students?
I would just say, read a lot, pay attention, be an astute news consumer, and be an engaged citizen. If you are getting your news on social media and what's being fed to you, beware of that. Seek out your news, seek out reliable sources, pay attention to what's happening in Olympia, in your state government. It may not be the most exciting thing to read about, but it's probably the most important and most substantive in terms of what will affect you and your family and your future. Get to know your state lawmakers, and you'd be surprised at how accessible they are and how much you might be able to influence something that's happening in Olympia simply by getting a few of your friends and colleagues together and raising an issue with your state lawmaker. They should know who you are. And that's possible to do, much easier to do than a member of Congress. So be engaged, always be learning, always be prepared for change, because we're definitely living in a time of very fast change. And when COVID is over, try to find a way to make it down to Olympia, especially during the legislative session, and be able to take in kind of what goes on in the hallways, in the chambers, in the legislature during a session. It's important to see it firsthand.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Connect. Thank you again so much, Austin, for sharing your time with us, and to our wonderful students, thank you for your brilliant questions. We'll see you again next time.